sun's out, we're okay.
Yeah, beautiful.
I don't know, I wonder what you would say. I would respond to you if you don't finish your
Oh,
sentence.
that's right.
I just took a chair.
Supposed to be real nice, yeah. Very good.
Good.
I see. I get it now. You're shaking my leg.
So far, okay. But I didn't get the golf later the way it's looking. I didn't gloss over it. Got you a little wet.
No, we mustn't talk about it.
Yeah, might be a little.
Hello, how are you? Good. Let me see. We saw each other.
I'll have what she's got.
Yeah. Me too.
I'll have what she's got. Right now,
I am. My table disappeared.
Oh, they know.
I still don't believe it. I think you're still holding my leg.
I know. They got everybody there.
Well, good morning, how are you?
Good seeing you.
We are what we are.
We are what we are.
It wouldn't even surprise
Only a number.
I hope I'm wrong.
Oh,
I hope
yeah.
that.
I just wondered out.
Hi. Well, yeah, we've been traveling.
Okay, you don't like
Are you gonna come? See you later.
Good morning, Shalom, good morning. How are you?
How are you?
I'm doing well.
Because I
Yeah, I like it.
you've done it. The other thing I was thinking, that's thought, but there's a lot of the things.
That must feel so good.
Very interesting. After, okay, well, this is, I know you're looking for, well, I was wondering one of them, if you send them out earlier, yes, please study this, we'll talk. Oh, doesn't tell us anything about what this thing the troops about the religion. Very much so. How does it make you?
it's the end of,
Well, I have it in here, yeah, but I can't remember. The other one's the Hollow Man, which begins with Lord God's chords, that's wonderful. This is how the world ends, not the world.
Closing the book.
good, excellent. I'll talk to Jordan about it. And I'll mention it to him too. Yeah, he did it for Cindy and. Good morning. Oh yeah, 25 minutes. Shabbat shalom. So good to see everybody. A beautiful day. Maybe spring has sprung. Be nice if it did.
Feeling better?
I'm doing better. I was a little under the weather yesterday, so I stayed home, and it was good to do. Instead of pushing every now and then, we have to step back a little bit. Of course, life is short, and so pushing is what we have to do to fit it all in. Baseball fans, anybody know what today is the 65th anniversary of?
That was what year?
I'm sorry?
That would be what year?
57. 1957. Herb Score hit in the eye by a batted ball. Remember that? Who hit the ball? Gil McDougall for the Yankees, first inning. And McDougall evidently was distraught in the clubhouse after, and he said if Herb Score loses his eye, he's going to retire from baseball. And I was actually delivering the Cleveland Plain Dealer that summer. And when I got out to the newspapers and saw the picture, you remember the first baseman who came over and had to turn away?
Yeah.
Vic Wertz. It was horrible. Speaking of delivering the Plain Dealer, it just occurred to me when I was thinking about it. My mother and I, to be a little personal here, had a dispute about how long I delivered the Plain Dealer. I said 4 years. She said 2 months. Talk about how our stories get longer and better as we age. Yeah.
I believe your mother.
What'd you say, Bill?
I think I'll believe your mother.
My mother was closer, that's for sure. Alan?
I'd say I would agree with your mother.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments, enjoining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. There's something nice about all of us being together. I mean, we have other tables. That one is gone today. But even though I know we like to spread out, there is something nice about the concentration here. So just to review what we've been doing this year, Immanuel Kant's 4 basic questions. 3 of them posed at the end of the Critique of Pure Reason, and 1 in his book on logic. What does it mean to be human? What can I know? What ought I to do? And for what can I hope? We looked a bit at what does it mean to be human. looking at the early chapters of the book of Genesis, which gives us two views of what it means to be human. If I could dare to summarize it, the first 11 chapters are human beings on their own, beginning with Abraham, the human beings in covenant with God. So the book of Genesis looms very large in terms of the Bible's anthropology. By anthropology, we mean, what does it mean to be human? The logos of anthropos. Then we looked at what ought I to do, and I think we noticed at least two important things. I'm very uneasy, actually, about biblical ethics, just having trouble putting my arms around it in its multiplicity. One part is being commanded to do certain things. We might call that positive law. That doesn't mean there aren't a lot of ambiguities in those laws, but nevertheless it says you shall do or you shall not do. The other is embedded in the narrative, so that nothing is stipulated in terms of what I ought to do, but the narrative presupposes certain values which can be drawn out by a careful and sensitive reading. So we looked at David and Bathsheba, and especially when the prophet Nathan comes to excoriate him for what he has done, and he tells him a parable, and when David hears the parable, he is enraged. And his being enraged is a sign of a moral sense. The injustice of a rich shepherd going to a poor shepherd who has only one lamb and taking it. The sense that all human beings have dignity and should be accorded some sympathy. So these are things that are not stipulated, like love your neighbor as yourself, but they are embedded in the narrative. And so this is another feature of the ubiquity, I might say, of narrative in the Bible, that it delivers its message oftentimes indirectly through the artistry of the author or the poet, which I suppose is one of the reasons that the Bible has been given to so much interpretation over the years, because we sense when we read it, then there is much more under the surface, I might say, than is stipulated in words. And therefore our sense that there is more leads us to want to find that more. I came across an interesting definition of poetry the other day. A poem is coherent enough. Isn't that nice? A poem, if we take a look at it, we can see what it's up to, but we can never arrive at the understanding of the total coherence of the poem, because it's always beyond language. After interpretation, the poem itself remains. We don't abandon the poem because we have interpreted it to the very end. Coherent enough. I like that. And I think that the biblical narrative in some way is also coherent enough. Love your neighbor as yourself. We get it. But what does it mean to love? How should is this a feeling or is it an activity? If it's an activity, what kind of activity? Who is my neighbor? I am the Lord. Love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. What does I am the Lord have to do with love your neighbor as yourself? Does it suggest made in God's image? Or is God the one who finally judges whether we have fulfilled that obligation? In other words, love your neighbor as yourself is I think, a good example of coherent enough. We get it. But we don't get it. It requires an interpretation, and in a way an ongoing interpretation as we live our lives and ask ourselves, who is my... if it's respect, I respect my neighbor. This one, not this one. Am I violating the commandment? Does the commandment say to me, love all your neighbors as yourself? And why does it end as yourself? What's the relationship between my self-love and my love for others? Seem to suggest I love myself first. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's the benchmark. Loving yourself, love your neighbor in the same way. Self-love can lead to narcissism and even solipsism. I'm the only one who matters. We say that's the basic major commandment, but what does it mean, and how do we exploit it or explore it? Gary?
Should we be looking to Midrash for some of these answers?
Absolutely. So we look at the history of interpretation to the degree that we can for insight, for guidance. Mordechai Kaplan says that the tradition has a vote but not a veto, which is pretty interesting, isn't it? Just change the vowels. Yes, our tradition matters. We can learn a great deal, but it doesn't have the status of commanding us to act in a certain way, because we, as Aristotle says, the decision rests with judgment. Not that Aristotle ever read the Torah, but I like that idea. So history of interpretation matters, as it does with so many things. Let me point out Jeffrey here just for a second, who is a singer and has done lots and lots of performances. You know that Jeffrey has sung around the world. I don't want to embarrass you here, but how to deal with a particular song, with a particular aria, I suppose you go back to listen to what others have done with it to gain some guidance about how you might do it. If I'm totally wrong about this, don't say so. Yeah. Okay, so it's so good. And by the way, we have an annual Erev Shavuot study session this year. It's on a Saturday night. Sunday is Shavuot. I think it's Saturday night, June 4th. And we're going to look at different narratives for the ethical content. So it's an extension of what it is we have been doing here, but I'm not presupposing that everybody who comes has done this. So we're going to start afresh in a way, but that's what we're going to do. Okay, so now we are looking at For What Can I Hope? And we began last week looking at David Hartman's really interesting essay. I have it in front of me with the title Sinai and Exodus, Two Grounds for Hope in the Jewish Tradition. And we made some headway in this piece. I want to go back and just review so that we can bring ourselves up to date about what it is we talked about, and then to move on. Okay, so again, some of this is a repetition, but it will give us a baseline after a week of not looking at it. Hope, he says, is a category of transcendence. And you remember that, at least my understanding of transcendence, is not necessarily God or Plato's ideas, but merely a look at a situation from the point of view of something more than the situation itself. Hope is a category of transcendence by means of which a person doesn't permit what he senses and experiences to be the sole criterion of what is possible. In other words, what we sense and experience takes place in the now. Transcendence is to appeal to something beyond the now to help us understand. He's going to explore this, but I think this is what he means. It is the belief or the conviction that present reality, in parentheses he says, what I see, does not exhaust the potentialities of the given data. Hope opens the present to the future. So the first element of transcendence is the future. To look at a given situation through the eyes of hope. What can this turn out to be? What will happen given what the present is? It enables a person to look ahead, to break the fixity of what we observe, and to perceive the world as open-textured. That's hope. The categories of possibility and of transcendence, I take it these are synonyms at this point. Possibility, not just the now, but what is not yet, transcending the now. The categories of possibility and of transcendence interweave a closely stitched fabric. Hope says that tomorrow can be better than today. Hope, however, is not merely an expectancy which draws its nourishment from the future while integrating and permeating the present. What I hope for has something to do with what I do today. Think of the Jews down through the centuries praying Shacharit today, hoping for the return of the Jews to the land of Israel. Every single Amida, every service today is permeated by what it is we hope to come. Harry?
I think you could turn that around. You know, hope implies that something better is going to happen sometime in the future.
Yeah.
If you replace hope by fear or apprehension, it's the thought that something worse might happen than you have today.
Right.
So it's all on how you want to frame your outlook.
No, I think it's a very, very good point, because you're right. I can be optimistic about the future, or I can be afraid of it. And maybe hope, the optimism, has an in spite of quality about it. In spite of the fact that I'm anxious about the future and it may not look good, or I may be of pessimistic cast of mind, nevertheless, I'm going to be expectant. So hope is not just one might call it a primary emotion, but in a way a secondary emotion as well. My first emotion may be anxiety, against which I offer hope if I want to not be crippled by the anxiety. I think you've got a good point here. I can be worried about the future too. So hope is a choice. I think that's one of the things that he would say. Jim?
But then would you, like in the situation where they're wandering in the desert, and then there's all kind of complaints where, that would be an example of the fear of the future.
Right.
But would you say the group, I don't know the answer to this, would you say the group had given up hope?
Well, it's a good point. And remember what we did last week, which we're going to review, and that is what Hartman calls the rupture into the course of history, exemplified by the Exodus. So the people had given up hope. You remember we went through parts of the first 4 or 5 chapters of Exodus where at the beginning people were active. Moses' sister and mother and the midwives and so on. But then by the time we get to the end of chapter 5, the people have despaired and they have said to Moses, "Why are you bothering us?" Which I take it might be in structural terms an anticipation of what you're talking about. In the wilderness where things seem so overwhelming that they despaired. So I think the answer to your question from last week, but we're gonna review it, is the Tanakh gives us moments in the course of its history where the people have or are about to give up. That returns us to the Exodus paradigm where God takes over. And that's one element of hope. We're going to get to the other element too, and that is Sinai. Bill?
I have to disagree with Jim's comment because I think the nature of human nature, out of the greatest despair,
Yes.
and I think of those in the concentration camps mostly,
Yes.
out of the greatest despair, out of the greatest sense that God has abandoned, still has hope. Because without that element of hope, you only have suicide.
Yeah.
And most people, even in the greatest moments of despair, continuous despair, with no rational thought of a hopeful future, will still not despair to the point of suicide, but will have hope that there will be some amelioration of their condition.
You think you have sufficient evidence for that, or is this kind of a priori value that you have?
I think the evidence is that people who are in, well, I'll use the concentration camp situation, is people who have survived, let's say, 2 years in a concentration camp. The only thing that keeps them alive is the hope that tomorrow it will end. There are those, I'm sure, that were in such despair that they did just curl up and die and have a sense of suicide. But I think most of those human nature, there is an inner self that drives one to live, to survive.
You're not denying that people can and have given up.
Absolutely, but I think it's a very small number compared to, if you have 100, I would say that it would be maybe 5.
You're hopeful about hope.
I think it exists. It's one of the strongest elements of human nature.
Well, it's an interesting point. I mean, I've made the claim a few minutes ago that hope is a choice, which suggests that we can not choose it. In dire circumstances, we can give up. And you're saying that really, yes, some might, but human nature is such that most people maintain some hope.
I'm going to use the example of the Tom Hanks movie where he's stranded on the island. I can't think of the Castaway, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Where a person in an isolated situation where there is probably no limited food, limited everything, except what? The hope that maybe this will end.
Okay. It's interesting because the Exodus paradigm that we did last week and we'll quickly review does end at, well, where I ended it, the people are in utter despair. And according to Hartman, that structures one kind of process in terms of our lives, that we can finally not think we have any resources of our own, and that it requires, or our hope is, for some breaking into reality. So you are, in a way, resisting, if not rejecting, the intensity, the absoluteness of that paradigm. Malcolm?
I may be stripping too much away here. It seems to me the term hope in its most basic notion is a view toward the future and looking for a state in the future which is different than the state that exists for me today. It doesn't connote, so to speak, better or worse. I mean, that's just from my view. So I wonder whether Kant's posing of this question is then, is it what can I morally and ethically hope for? What is it legitimate for me to hope?
You seem to be saying, see if I understand you correctly, that hope shouldn't be seen as a prescriptive or a normative term. It's a descriptive one. Hope is merely some anticipation of some future, not necessarily a better future. Yeah. That's an interesting point. I mean, does hope contain within itself some positive expectation that it's not merely descriptive?
Well, it's only Putin hopes for something different than I hope for.
No, it's not a matter of what the content of the hope is. It can be perverse.
Yes.
But still, you are wanting something that is a little better than what you have. A person who commits suicide.
Different.
I'm sorry?
Different.
Well, that's your point here. Myself, I think it is a value-laden term. I want something better. But you're challenging that. You're challenging that. And I think it's worth thinking about. Charlotte?
When you hope and when you despair, the thing you're hoping for is that you should be able to deal with the tragedy.
Right.
Not that you can change it, but you have to deal with it.
Well, that's a good point. So that hope can be the hope for a different state of affairs, or it can be whatever the state of affairs, I am going to be hopeful that I can manage it.
That's the hope.
Yeah. And managing it is a value-laden process. It's a good thing. I'm hoping I can do better than I might do with the future that awaits me. Let's go on a little bit, and we'll come back. So, hope, however, he says, is not merely an expectancy which draws its nourishment from the future. While integrating and permeating the present, it may have its roots in memory. Okay? So that he opens up the three tenses, past, present, and future. And from the present, I can have hope that points to a better future or that refers to some past that gives me hope. I remember as a shortstop that I made no errors last season. So what do I hope? What's the content of my hope for this season? That I can do in the present what I did in the past. The past is paradigm or as model. Okay? Thus, Hartman says, the present can be influenced by two perspectives of time which create the capacity to transcend. Just to say what I've said before. Transcend here doesn't mean God or something in another realm. It just means other than the present, or the present animated by another temporal dimension, future or past. The future may be a source of hope, which encourages a person to overcome present despair, and the past, or one's memory of accomplished events, may provide a key for opening the present beyond its facticity, what it is, and givenness, and may escort him past what is given in our present experience. I think that's very eloquently stated, and says a lot of things. Two kinds of hope. and the impact of past and future on the present. He goes on to say, two kinds of hope. One can describe two aspects of hope: the courage to bear human responsibility, to persevere in partial solutions, and to accept the burden of living and building within contexts of uncertainty. Don't you just love that? Partial solutions, the burden of living, contexts of uncertainty, that's one. And two, the expectancy of a future resolution to all human problems. Partial, total. The first aspect might be called halachic hope, law, guidance, norms. And the second, radical hope, complete resolution, suggesting what Gershom Scholem calls restorative. I see what we've done in the past, and we want to try to do that again, even though it was partial. And utopian, two views of messianism. Maybe he's gone beyond what we need to do here. The first halachic form of hope liberates action. It frees one to act, for it overcomes the paralysis of dejection. I can do something. The emphasis being the I, we, you. We have agency, and agency matters. It frees one to act, for it overcomes the paralysis of dejection. Where one's outlook is thoroughly hopeless, and where the notion of duty appears meaningless, one's capacity to act is impaired. A prospect of attainment generates strength. If I see a goal that I think I can accomplish, it animates my desire to act, while despair incapacitates. Expectancy that something new and good may occur often creates the very power necessary to implement one's goals. Let's see where we are here. So he says here, we've so far presented two different approaches to hope. One which anticipates final resolution, radical, the emergence of a new man and of a new history, and which often awaits redemption irrespective of human action. And the other which insists on teshuvah, that I can return, teshuvah's return, to return to fundamentals. I can get a new beginning for my own actions. So, halachic and teshuvah are two Hebrew words that help to us to understand the first kind of hope. Hope which inspires agency. Okay? So I have to rethink my values, and I have to follow norms and laws, or at least that's the content of this hope. These two attitudes to redemption and to hope may have their roots in two dissimilar historic memories. One attitude may emerge from consideration of the Exodus, the other from remembrance of Sinai. The former undergirds Exodus, a rupture concept of history. And remember, last week we had a long discussion on Gary's worry about the rupture theory. Is the Exodus really a rupture? And I tried to argue from looking at the text that it does. The people had gotten to a point, but only through trying to engage in a solution to their own problems and finding that it didn't work. maybe I overstate the Bible's arrival at despair, but that's what I think happens, but of course that's open for discussion. The former, Exodus, undergirds a rupture concept of history, the latter a covenantal concept of history. How interesting is that? The Exodus model, by way of anticipation, emerges from a sense of impotence. I can't really resolve or deal positively with my situation, and therefore is dependent on something else. And in a theistic universe, that something else is God. The other builds on three concepts: halakha, law, norm; teshuvah, the work that I have to do on myself in order to improve; and covenant, relationship. And I take it so far what he means by relationship is relationship with God. But it can also be with relationship with one another. A covenantal view of history makes primary, no, a covenantal view of history worries about an individuated view of the experience of what I need to do. I'm not just an individual. Doesn't Aristotle open the politics, I think, by saying man by definition is a social animal? By which he means the opposite of what we've come to mean through the Enlightenment. Remember, the social contract theories, for example, John Locke's theory, is that we're all individuals, and we recognize that you can beat me up. And if you can't beat me up, a couple of you can. And if a couple of you can't, 3 of you, 4 of you, my life is always in peril. And because of that, I decide to give up some of my inherent rights as an individual and form a contract, a social contract. Locke's theory presupposes the primacy of the individual, and the community is merely a construct. The community is not a natural entity. Whereas the classical understanding is society is what is natural, communal, community, relationship. And it's only in and through those relationships that I gain my individuality. So the Enlightenment really turned it around, okay? So what Hartman is suggesting here is that the Jewish historical understanding is somehow the primacy of relationship, out of which comes an individuality. I wouldn't assert all of that to the death, but I think that it's plausible. The Jewish tradition provides, he says, many collective recollections. In order to organize and to rationalize his experience, a person may select from his store of memories those events which can serve as principles of integration. So that when you study history, think about history, it provides several ways of looking at the present, several different models. So, for example, the Exodus model, which focuses on my relative or absolute helplessness, my need of help, or the Sinai model, which features the primacy of agency. I have those models back there which can illuminate my own stance in different ways. At different times and in different circumstances of one's life, different events may be chosen. Indeed, phenomenologically speaking, religious practical systems are often tied more intimately to collective memories than to metaphysical beliefs. And that's a packed sentence. I think what he's saying is that the religious traditions tend to focus on story and not ideas. That Christians learn about what it means to be a Christian through the reading of the Gospels, the story of Jesus, right? Not only. The Bible features stories. It doesn't try to isolate ideas and show their plausibility, their power, their truth. It's not a philosophical text. That's what I think he means. Despite the presence of various themes in the biblical story itself, the memory of the Exodus from Egypt provides a theological model where human beings are basically helpless before God. Human beings in no way warrant their redemption, nor do they cooperate prominently in their deliverance. That may be a little questionable, don't you think? Moses plays a significant role. Maybe he's overstated it here. Although Moses didn't split the Red Sea, the final moment of redemption, crossing the sea and then having the waters come back over the Egyptians, is the climax and culmination, and that's a miracle. And I think it's fair to say that the book of Exodus features more miracles than any other book in the Bible. As a matter of fact, what's his name? Jack Miles, got a biography, points out that there's kind of a developmental view of biblical history on the model of an individual. In my early months and years, I'm dependent. And therefore, I'm dependent upon miracles. My God, there's milk. Yeah. Pablum, where'd that come from? It came from God. Your mother. Right? And as the biblical story continues, miracles recede until at the very end of the Bible, God is not involving God's self at all in the history. He's referred to. God is worshipped, but not active. And one of the names of God at the end of the Bible is the Ancient of Days. He's sitting there on the throne. We can worship him, but just as human beings move, if things go well, from dependence to independence, although the independence may still be covenantal, because I'm still, at best, living out the values that I learned from my parents. I still am in relationship with them, even though they're no longer walking the earth. I think that's a point that Hartman is going to focus on. So the empirically given, he says, is no. The memory of the Exodus from Egypt provides a theological model where human beings are basically helpless before God. Human beings in no way warrant their redemption, nor do they cooperate preeminently in their deliverance. In this model, God suddenly breaks into history, and from no people, he creates his elected community. Stuart?
Let's see. Aaron, not Moses, is God's mouthpiece.
Okay.
Speaks to Pharaoh words that are dictated to him by God. The people play no role, no active role in that at all.
Right. So are you intending by your comment to underline the importance of that idea that the
Yes.
people are passive?
Yes.
Right.
People play no role at all. They are told to prepare for leaving Egypt.
Right.
They leave Egypt.
They do borrow things from their neighbors, but very late in the game, so to speak. By and large, I think you're right.
They steal.
I'm sorry?
They steal, they don't borrow.
They steal. They steal. Yeah. You had to say that, didn't you? Yeah. And that raises a lot of problem for the commentators. Is it reparations? That's one idea, they've been ransacked for centuries, and they deserve some reparations on the way out. Maybe it's an attempt to rationalize. Jim?
But in our discussion of the word hope,
Yes.
I think I'm coming up with hope strongly implies the divine has to be involved. Because if you hope for something, or a group of people hope for something, doesn't necessarily mean they're planning any way to get there. They're hoping for some intervention from somewhere else.
Yes.
So I think it strongly underlines the role God plays when you hope for something.
Except there's going to be another kind of hope which promotes agency. Right now we're talking about the Exodus paradigm.
Right, but the hope there is, and it comes to be, that there's some divine intervention.
Absolutely.
Because we hope we get out of this, but we don't have any plan to do it.
Right. And what are you intending by that comment? To clarify the idea?
That if you're hoping for something, it strongly implies you need some outside intervention.
Oh, that's a good point.
Namely God.
So your idea is that hope, by definition, is based on some sense of powerlessness. I'm hoping that something will happen that I can't create. That's how you understand hope. True?
True.
Hartman, of course, is saying that there are two kinds of hope. I hope that I do well on my test tomorrow. Well, I'm not going to sit back and let God do the test for me or provide a miracle or all of a sudden I know the answers. I've got to work on it. So couldn't hope be an engine for action?
Yes, but I think in what you just said, I think you used the word hope, not in its true meaning.
Oh, okay. You think that hope, by definition, presupposes some incapacity on the part of human beings. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying it needs some, for lack of a better term, if you're hoping for some additional help that you don't have.
Yeah. And couldn't the additional hope be one's girding up one's own loins?
Yeah, but you're asking for something to help you get there.
Couldn't I be asking myself? Yes, okay. So what you seem to be saying is that hope is for what is not yet. And then the question is, what's the content of that hope? Is the not yet going to come to pass by another being or through my own agency? Yeah. Hope, by definition, you're suggesting, is a recognition of the gap between what is and what is possible. Jeff?
I wrote a note earlier, and I think it was a quote from what he said, which is that hope is an expectancy.
Yeah.
If I'm understanding that correctly, it isn't something that, if you expect something to happen, I think you need to ask, why would that be? That leads me from the Exodus model into the covenant model, which is, you have obligations to me, I have obligations to you. So I'm wondering why he's distinguishing between an Exodus model and a covenantal model if he's positing that hope is an expectancy. Does that make any sense?
Up to the last comment. Say that last
I always
thing.
go too far. Forget the last comment.
Okay. I'm not sure what you're saying here.
What I'm saying is that we're talking about two models of hope.
Right.
He started by saying hope is an expectancy, and now we're talking about hope perhaps suggesting, I don't know if it's going to happen, I don't necessarily, hope different from optimism, for example. I really think it's going to happen.
Okay.
Hope otherwise being, I really don't know. And
Yeah.
it's not inconsistent with some despair. I can be hopeful, but I don't know that it's really going to happen.
Okay. I think.
So I'm wondering why there are these two models to begin with.
Don't you think that if we have a continuum, let's say from X to Y, that the Exodus, and X is Exodus, and Y is Sinai, that we can be arrayed along that continuum? I can just despair that any action of mine will have efficacy. Now I'm way over here at the X. On the other hand, I can say to myself, don't depend on anything or anybody else, depend on yourself. Now I'm way over here at the Y part of the continuum. Couldn't I say that there's a mix here that I can... See, the covenantal model, when you think about it, I thought maybe this was your point, also brings God into the picture.
Oh, yes.
Was
I'll
that...
take credit for that, yeah.
Okay. Phew, I thought you were in trouble there for a while.
Yeah, so did I.
But you seem to be eliding
I am.
the two.
I am, and the reason I'm eliding it is that he made a covenant with Abraham, and we studied that several months ago.
Yes.
So are we now saying, having made a covenant, we go to an Exodus model that presumes there is no covenant?
Oh, I see, Jay. You're talking historically and not conceptually.
I'm sorry, that's it. I'll give up, yeah, I can't possibly. You're a better tennis player, I can't return.
You can't return the serve. I can always lower the net.
Thanks.
It's true that God made a covenant with Abraham. Well, there are two kinds of covenant. A promissory covenant, which is unilateral. I give you this land. And a bilateral covenant, which is hypothetical. If you do the right thing, you will come into the land will be yours. And both are at work in the Torah here. So, I think what Hartman means by covenant here is relationship, where both parties in the relationship have agency. And not just a kind of covenantal model which gets very close to the Exodus model. When God who did the work in Genesis chapter 1? God, and only God. That was, I might call it, the rupture model. Genesis 1 is the rupture model. All of a sudden, from tohu vavohu, from formlessness and void, comes a world. That's way over here at the X thing. And the unilateral covenant is the same thing. Human beings do nothing to get the promise of land from God. And especially when God said it's a brit olam, it's an eternal promise. Now agency has nothing to do with it, ultimately. We may be in exile for 2,000 years, but the promise still holds and we're going back. But the bilateral covenant now depends upon the Sinai model, that human beings have a role to play in carrying out or realizing that hope. True? True? Did I get to your question, or did I get a...
Yeah, I don't want to hijack this. I mean,
Yeah.
I have a lot of questions about it, but...
Okay, good. Okay, very good, very good, very good. Gary?
Well, I think this discussion of hope it's more than unidimensional. And your point about a continuum emphasizes that to me. You have a bilateral situation here. It's not unidimensional. And having hope has both agency and commitment from God. And I think we can each come up with various experiences from our own lives to support both of those situations. And you've brought up a number of, I have a test tomorrow, I hope I do well, it's all with you. Well, I'm mortally ill now, the doctors have told me there's no treatment, I can only hope from God that God will prolong my life. I mean, there's all kinds of examples.
Yeah, because when you think about it, now dealing with the narrative, the Exodus is the precondition for Sinai. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt and so on. Now I have the right to command you. So the Bible's view of agency is that it's agency in and through a relationship with God. When we get to the Enlightenment, maybe before, well, certainly before, there's secularism from the word saculum that means this world, one world only. And we're on our own. And we're capable. I mean, Newton, in a couple of variables and a constant, understood the relationship of all bodies throughout the universe. Talk about power inherent in the human mind. We can solve our problems. Matter of fact, religion is an impediment to solving our problems because it's filled with superstition and it leads to wars that wreck life. Let's get rid of religion. We can do it. That's a non-covenantal view of human agency. And I think that Hartman wants to say, and I think it's an elegant thing to say, is that the Bible has a very powerful model of hope with two moments, an Exodus paradigm and a Sinai paradigm, which are not oppositions. They both can operate in sense along a continuum. I can believe that I'm on my own. Yeah, I got laws or rules or so on, but I'm on my own, and we try to work together as a community. Or I think of myself as responsible to a relationship that precedes me. But my agency is still enabled. And Hartman is going to get into two kinds of relationship, parent-child, husband-wife. And wants to say, we'll get there, that the biblical model is not parents and children, where I am without capacity and I'm dependent, and much more husband and wife, friends, mutual friends, and so on. Alan?
Isn't hope an expectancy for things to get better despite the evidence that you perceive? I mean,
Well put.
Why am I here today? I saw this week a pit of people filled with people in the Ukraine. I saw that same pit filled with people at Baba Yar. And yet I'm still here hoping that maybe somewhere along the line we can reach a point where we don't fill pits with people.
Yeah. Or at least move in that direction. Yeah. That's the expectancy idea. And the expectancy of something better. That's what you're saying.
And that's what Sinai offered us, something better.
You know, in order to really get to the bottom of what the meaning of hope is, we'd have to do a word search, wouldn't we? If I wanted to know what it means in the Bible, I would look at all the expressions of hope in the Bible and try to draw some sense of it. Is Malcolm right that there is a descriptive and not a prescriptive understanding of hope in the Bible? I know your point was not so much Bible, but the meaning of it. But we can only get to the meaning through seeing its uses. Really, isn't this true? Gosh. Oh, boy. Yeah. So what I was struggling to say or not to say is the following. Maybe the most important philosopher of the 20th century was Ludwig Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein essentially wrote one book, and then the rest of his writings were kind of put together by students. And the one book was the so-called Tractatus, where he tried to show the structure of language. And he ends elegantly with the statement, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. Because we can't really talk, he says, about ethics or about religion. Those are nonsense things. He rejects this kind of logical positivism and moves to ordinary language philosophy, where he's now looking at use. We can only understand something. What does it mean to promise? I don't know. Let's look at how we use promise in our own language, and from there. And that's, in a way, what we're thinking about here in terms of that. How is it used? We all have views about what it means. Okay, Candy.
Where does the idea of Bashir come in?
Isn't Bashert fate?
Well,
Whatever I
I
did,
think it's God, but
yeah, or I guess, or God. I like fate better than God here. I mean, it's as if somebody was telling me something the other day about that. We just happen to have an experience which leads to something that leads to everything. How did that happen? It was destined. Yeah. And I think the notion of fate, am I right that the Greeks thought that fate even impacted the gods? So that the gods are not, so fate is blind, isn't it? I think I'll give Roger Klein an experience later this afternoon which is going to change his life. No.
but I think it's connected to God's idea of the world and writing it all down in a book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who shall live and who shall die,
Yeah.
and a limited sense of individual power
Right,
to change
right.
things.
Right, but who
And
shall
that
live and
impacts hope in a lot of ways.
who shall live and who shall die, though, is dependent to some significant degree on my deeds, but not entirely. Right? There is a sense of we don't have full control over our lives. You know, maybe let me try this. The difference between, let's think structurally. We're human beings. We've got some powers, and there are limits to our powers. The limits to our powers can take us in two directions. There's nothing else, we're just limited, or there's something else that is having an impact on our lives. What might those something else's be? Lots of stuff. Here are two of them. Fate and God. The biblical notion of God is that God reflects mind, thought, purpose. The first chapter of Genesis is beautifully structured. It's a rational entity, this world of ours, according to the Bible. Fate is mindless. God is a moral character who cares about good and bad. So God has both mind and thought and purpose, whereas fate is blind. Now, who knows what? So there are three possibilities here at least. Nothing, fate, and God. And I take it we all have a view about this for ourselves. Do we feel Heidegger's view? We're just thrown into the world. There's no rhyme and reason. Life is tragic. He has this notion of being toward death. We come into the world, when we begin to think about things, we recognize we're mortal, we're going to die. And knowing that we're going to die creates a deep anxiety, an existential anxiety. Not I'm anxious about tomorrow's test. I'm anxious about life. So that's Heidegger's an empty universe. And we're just thrown here. And what's our role? What's our reaction? To man up and to say, you know what, I know my destiny. I'm not going to create an imaginary heaven or an imaginary set of absolute values. There's just this world, and that's all there is to it. And if you want to live a good human life, you'll acknowledge it and live in its presence. That's a pretty despairing way to live, isn't it? He wrote his great book, Being in Time, 10 years after World War I was over. We've seen the impact of World War I on culture. Or fate. Things happen without our agency, and why? For no reason at all. You just happened upon something and you found your spouse. Wow, the universe is looking out for me. No, it just happened that way. So fate is a little bit better than nothing. But God is very much better. Now I'm just speaking for the religions. Because it suggests that in the structure of the universe, there's purpose, there's good and bad, there's the possibility of a mind at work beyond my mind and work. That's a very hopeful view, isn't it? Isn't God an extremely hopeful view about the nature of things? And I always talk about the Bible, the biblical author's dare. The dare is, I'm going to present a picture of the way things are. I know there are alternative pictures. I know there are powerful alternative pictures. I'm going to try to convince you about this one. And I got to do it dialectically. I've got to say, yes, this is a value, but you know what? Maybe it's a problem. The Bible does just that. Job challenges Deuteronomy. What sort of mind says, I'm going to put Job in the story that I'm trying to promote to people, that things make sense? That's pretty amazing. Who was that person or people who said, Job belongs in, Ecclesiastes belongs in there. Psalm 88, read Psalm 88. It's just total despair. And there's no hope at all at the end of it. If I'm putting together the book if somebody says to me, would you gather these poems and put them in a corpus, because we're going to put it into the Bible. And among the things I see, by the waters of Babylon, I say, the Lord is my shepherd, happy is the man. Yeah, these belong in. Psalm 88. No way. This is going to cause people to despair. You know what, though? I'm putting it in anyway, because real life has this as well. Okay, Bill?
This whole conversation leads me to conclude that there's this great inadequacy of the human vocabulary. I mean, it appears that, like when Gary talks about linear and tooth paths, I'm sure many people will take from this conversation that those paths constantly intertwined, and that there is not a separate path of language or understanding of the word hope or any of the words that are related to it. And I think everybody has, in some respects, created their own vocabulary on trying to attach this. I was thinking the same thing with trying to define the word faith. It becomes, I think, sometimes very difficult to get a definitive understanding because there's so many mixtures of experiences.
No, I don't know. We're understanding each other today, aren't we? I mean, sure, language has ambiguities, but let me remind us of the definition of poetry that I brought earlier. This conversation is coherent enough, isn't it? We've communicated with one another.
Coherent but not definitive.
Well, it's never definitive because language is living
That's what I'm saying.
and is responsive to what's going on the ground. It's a living entity. But by and large, we communicate pretty well. The more abstract the concept, the more problems there are. There are two kinds of faith. Faith in, which is trust, and faith that, which is propositional. I believe that God created the heavens. I believe that God sent his only beloved Son, and things like that. That's not faith in, that's not trust, that's assent to claims. Is that understandable? We've made progress now on what faith is. Definitive once and for all progress? Of course not. But good enough. Don't you think good enough? Okay. All right, so let's turn to Sinai. So Sinai suggests quite another theological model upon which a human being can nurture a sense of hope. And now he's quoting Exodus 24. And Moses took the book of the covenant, read in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do and we will obey. Okay? So that's after the Sinai revelation. So they're assenting to what they have heard. And Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant which the Lord made with you concerning these words. Now, Hartman, the giving and acceptance of the Torah doesn't present a picture of God's single-handed redemption of powerless slaves, nor of unilateral divine ordering of primal chaos. This is not God all by God's self creating the universe, God all by God's self splitting the Red Sea. Rather, the experience of Sinai is one in which God speaks and human beings respond. The law, capital L, reveals divine confidence in human beings. In spite of the short-sightedness and weakness Israel showed in the desert. By the way, Jim pointed to all the complaining in the wilderness. Two things to say about that. One, nevertheless, the people keep going. And two, who's the real hero of the book of Numbers? God. God stays with the project, even when people despair. The law reveals divine confidence in man in spite of the short-sightedness and weakness Israel showed in the desert. The Torah symbolized divine acceptance of finite mortals. Don't you think this is rich? The Bible says, yes, we are weak, we vacillate, we do the wrong thing, we do it again and again and again, and yet the Torah has confidence in us by commanding us. And who does the commanding? God. So the God of the universe, who all by God's self created the world, split the Red Sea, made the sun stand still for Joshua, turns stuff over to us. The Bible's view of humanity is an exalted one, isn't it? While recognizing what's problematic. It, the Bible, signified God's move from creator-redeemer to teacher, to instructor, who is prepared to educate, to guide, and to impart of himself. The giving of the Torah at Sinai expressed a belief in that human beings have the capacity to implement right behavior in our lives. Right behavior, which alters the path of time, right? If I help somebody, I've introduced difference into the world. A sense of hope emerges from the memory of the command to become holy. Despite human limitations, weaknesses, perversities, and ugliness, Human beings are charged with responsibility, and we are even called by God to become part of a holy people. Right, that great opening of Leviticus 19, which is the Torah portion for this week. You shall be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. What's the paradigm for human behavior? God. And God is everything. God is perfect, let's say. We're charged to become perfect. Never fully achieved, but that's a pretty exalted thing. If somebody said to me, you shall be Roger Federer because I am Roger Federer. Now, if somebody said to me, you can do this, I would have first have said, you got to be kidding. Well, wait a minute, that person has some confidence in me. So I can't move from 1 to infinity, but I can move from 1 to 10. 1 to 100, 1 to 400. I can hit my backhand every now and then. Well, why? Why did I do that? Well, because I had a model. This is how Roger Federer would have done it. So 99 out of 100, I hit it into the net. But 1 was more than I could have done before I had a model. You shall be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Wow, that's a big expectation. It didn't say, you shall draw a 5-sided square, which is impossible. It just said, you can climb the ladder toward me. Don't you think that's amazing? In contrast to certain Greek notions of self-sufficiency, the revelation at Sinai proclaims that perfection is to be realized in relationships. The covenant biblical God chose interaction with human beings. The Lord of history, as opposed to an impersonal ground of being, pronounces that interdependency is an ultimate datum of reality. Interdependency is what we are. We're dependent on one another. History and community, therefore, that's the problem with all the social contract theorists, by the way. It suggests that at some point human individuals got together. I get the point of it, but it assumes that we're individuals first foremost, and only by an act create community. History and community, therefore, are central to a tradition where perfection is grounded in relationship. Hope need not be fulfilled. Hope need not be fueled by romantic dreams. It can be nurtured by feelings of adequacy to bear the responsibility of becoming a spiritual person. And by the knowledge that in spite of failures, I'm given a task. The very giving of commandments, that is the understanding of myself as commissioned, even while knowing myself to be a creature, is a source of confidence. Let me put it differently. A source of hope. The Torah, the eternal mitzvah, binds hope into obligation. And here's a footnote, an interesting one. This may shed light on the Talmudic preference for action based on divine commandment above spontaneous behavior. Here's an example. Greater is the person who does an act which he is commanded to do than the person who doesn't act on what he is not commanded to do. Let's take the traditional view of Shiva minyan. Who has the responsibility to be in the minyan? Men and not women, traditionally. Who is the more praiseworthy? The man who is commanded to do it and does it? Or the woman who is not commanded to do it but does it? I guess that our sensibility is the woman. Because this is a free choice. But what he's pointing to is that the tradition suggests that the man, having a relationship and acting responsibly in the relationship, is better than asserting the ultimacy of myself, and I'm going to make a choice. The heroic individual. You know, Immanuel Kant says, dare to use your own reason. The ultimacy of individual responsibility. For Kant, our duty does not come from tradition. It doesn't come from an outside authority. It comes from myself. I legislate my own morality. There's the Enlightenment in a nutshell. The glorious individual who, in his or her integrity and thoughtfulness, can do the right thing, as opposed to a more covenantal view of duty, where it's what the relationship which precedes my choices asks of me. That's what Hartman is pulling out here. I mean, we don't have to go along with it, but I think the modern sensibility, being much more individualistic, prefers the woman who's not commanded. And nevertheless, I see the point, I'm going to do it. Whereas the tradition begins with relationship. Don't you think it's a... So Bill's point about, we really can't, I'm caricaturing your point, I don't mean to, that we just can't, it's hard to understand one another. But we get this point, don't we? That one has to do with the ultimacy of relationship and the other has to do with the ultimacy of the individual. And which is better? I don't know. It's just, these are two paradigms. Stuart, and I think we'll have to stop.
And God, when the ark was being carried into Jerusalem,
Yes.
and it slipped, and the two men attempted to save it, God struck them dead.
Yeah. Namely, these were two guys who were devoted to the relationship. And they were trying to protect the Torah, which is a gift from God. Namely, the people who had the obligation and did it got zapped.
Yeah,
That's your point.
right.
Gosh, you know, we're out of time. Yeah.
We're going to hear back.
Here is a very lame response, but nevertheless, I think not a bad one to start. Something else is going on there, and not this thing. So if one says that what this footnote says has to apply to the entire scripture, then we've got a big problem. Because that's the antithesis of this. These are guys that did the right thing. Why? Not because they were Kantians, that they thought it was right, but because they were in a relationship. And they get zapped. So, gosh, what's to say here? I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right. The second thing is it opens us up to the possibility that other things are going on, like the danger of getting too close to holiness. The closer you get to holiness, the more power. You're going to be in the presence of power, and power is a value-neutral entity. It can be power for good, it can be power for bad. Moses, take off your shoes, you're standing on holy ground. You're approaching holiness here. Be careful. And I think that the Torah also has this, I might call it, amoral view of power. Dangerous holiness. And I think that's what's going on there. But it doesn't put aside Stuart's worry, because it is in conflict with other things the Torah is trying to say. And therefore we've got a little bit of a problem. It's the problem of what kind of text are we dealing with? Is there some ultimate coherence? Or is this, a kind of what's the word here? A mosaic. And that's what modern scholarship has come to, actually. Different sources with different interests and ideas put together in a way that becomes a problem. So one out might be my idea here, that this was written by a different sensibility who had a worry of his or her own, different from the sensibility of the footnote. I might say I've solved the problem. On the other hand, you've got an anthology of poetry from Chaucer to Keats. All the poems aren't going to say the same thing. That's what an anthology does. It brings different voices. Is the Torah an anthology? That's a problem. Because we would like to say that there's a worldview at work here that has power and coherence, but not everything coheres. That's a problem. I think Stuart not only points a problem with this example, but in a larger sense, a problem with trying to understand this book of ours. I used to watch these televangelists. I used to watch them quite a bit. I found them fascinating. They quote the Bible, but if you took notes on what passages they quoted very selectively. And just really a small group of passages. I do it too, for crying out loud. I never quote the book of Nahum. Ever hear the book of Nahum? I said on a test at rabbinical school, the guy asked us to write something about Obadiah. And I had the gall to say, I never heard of Obadiah on a test. I think he failed me on that one. That was not very adroit. I could have taken a stab at it. But we all do that, don't we? We quote scripture. We have our favorite passages. Anyhow, got a bar mitzvah waiting. So we'll continue with this next week. What I hope to do is finish this piece and then look at some other biblical passages, not just Exodus and Sinai, for biblical hope. Charlotte?
I just want to raise one question before we close it, is how do we deal with people whose lives are just one horrible tragedy after another, and that there's no way to explain what's happening?
Right. Well, look, there are two possible answers to this. I can find an answer. God is testing us. And God only tests those who are strong enough to deal with it. Okay, so that's category one. I can't not have an answer. I've got to have an answer. So I'm trying some. That's one of them. Does it work? Does it not work? The other possible answer is, I have no idea. It's the void. We face the void. And I think that the theistic religion, this is the Achilles heel of a theistic religion. After all, if we had a polytheism, we had the God of good, we had the God of evil. There was an early Christian sect, the Gnostics, who believed that the God of love makes no appearance in the Old Testament. That's just the demiurge, and the demiurge is limited. Well, that's a powerful reading of our problem. Here's a way around it. The Bible doesn't really have the God of mercy. It has the God of justice, of vengeance. And it's a powerful book, but it can't explain this sort of thing. Why? Because it's not the God of the universe. It's only with the New Testament, with the arrival of Jesus, the Son of God, where God so loved the world that he gave his only Son so that we can have salvation. So that's another way of doing it. The Bible is limited. That's what the early Gnostics, or Marcion, who was a very important early Christian thinker. But if we don't agree with that, if the God of the universe really makes an appearance in the Bible, then that creates the problem you're pointing to. And it strikes me that it's only a glibness that pushes us to try to find an answer to this question, which I think is finally the void, isn't it? I mean, as Bill points out, or Jim, I can't remember, people in the Holocaust, in the concentration camps, which was a definition of the abyss, still had some of them the desire to go on, to live, to say the Shema. My God. So human beings can rise up against the void, but I don't think we could generalize at all. Some people are able to do it and some aren't. And those who aren't are confronted with the really real. Yeah. A lot of stuff. Okay. Shabbat shalom. Wonderful point you made. Oh, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, this is the real stuff. You didn't let me get away with the footnote, nor should I have. See you. I'm technically on.
I have 3 questions then.
That's what. Oh, is that happen in the opera?
I'm a great routine fan now.
All right, we'll talk.
Was it me? What, this is chicken. Oh, yes, I'll try it. Sure. And I eat lemon chicken. Yeah. It was really good. I ate it for a week. It was really good. And Tuesday, is it the seniors? No. It's Tuesday. You were going to Oakland to go to the museum, but I can't go because of, yes, because of mine. Right. Okay, good. I'm glad you guys are going. I said you were supposed to. I said, yeah, 17th or 18th. You're supposed to pick a day. You're supposed to get with Jen. Jen's here today. You can stop.
Well, I'm going to ask them if I can set up 5 or something.
Yes. Yes, that's all Jen first thing. And I talked to Barbara about money. Don't worry about money. We're talking about the the acacia picnic. And we both agreed
Nice to see you.
that we should charge $5 and use that as far as it goes, and pay for the rest by subsidizing.
Yeah, consider it.
And, that's right, and we're gonna subsidize,
Yeah.
we are gonna invite the staff, and we're gonna subsidize their spring by,
Have you been coming for
and we're gonna must register. No, $5 per person, $10 per family.
Is the number
$5 per person, $10 per family. And invite the staff, not invite the staff, invite them to come, and we'll subsidize it, and we know that we won't have right, because we still have water, and we still have tablecloths, but I think that's all we want. And I think we had, we all made cookies, the three of us or something, so we should do that, and if we could, there's somebody else on our committee too, is it Yvonne? Good, then we'll get her to bake, or in charge of recruiting people to make cookies, so that
No, I think, and for me, it's nothing.
I might well just come because,
right, okay.
Let's assume 30 people come, so 3
That's, well, that's what we did, and then we put it on the table before, oh, I remember, I made cupcakes or something, yeah.
You did.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, ice cream cone cupcakes.
Yeah.
That look, yeah, they
I
look
just
good.
wound up with a lot
Thank you.
You're welcome, Ann.
Okay, so, yeah, so we gotta get going on that, and
I'm gonna
plus
check
we're
out.
doing that,
Right.
well,
the thing that.
so I talked, I think I mentioned about sanctuary on the green also. I can't remember. We talked to Barbara about other events, about the picnic, which is most important, and then I also had to talk to her about nominating somebody to be on the,
No, they aren't.
I know, I got news
so I
for
don't think I
one,
got around to talk to her about sanctuary on the green.
finally was
So,
New York Met.
we did talk, but next May, the committee is already coming together to take that underground rail. I talked to Kathy about it, and we're gonna go to Rupture and go on the walk. Yeah, we're gonna take that tour, the public tour that is offered by Adosin, to see if it's good enough for us to schlep a bunch of people there. And then we're gonna decide what we're gonna do, and that's scheduled for next May. So, so I have to wait and see until June, what's gonna.
I would never spend $400.
No, we're gonna get
And you not how much.
Sanctuary would have been great if we could.
Well, I wonder about it.
Maybe if I went.
It's too much for everybody. Okay, so,
I'm doing well.
as soon as we can have it, that's gonna be a whole calendar. I think it's gonna be okay. But what we need to do is, we need to write us.
It's all good. It's all, that's all.
No,
It's all. I can.
we need to send this to Barbara now.
It's okay.
We don't, but what she needs to know is, she needs to know that we're not doing it in October. So you need to email her. We looked into Sanctuary on the Green. It's impossible for us to have this in October because they will be into their Christmas. They will be into their Christmas deals, and that we would like to have it in the spring. And you could say, please put us down as an alternative to the underground, if something gets canceled in May. That's what we should do. So if you do that, then I'll, because it was the third thing on my list to talk to her about. And Barbara is very It's funny when you work with other people. No, she doesn't. She doesn't like to talk in person either. She likes to get it all on paper. So I sent her a note, an email that said, "Dear Barbara, I want to talk to you about money for the picnic and about the Waterloo Walk nomination for the Kind Lifers. When would be a good time for me to call and have that conversation with you?" And she called me back like 2 hours later at noon. And fortunately, she got me at a time when it was,
Yeah, well, you
I
told
was
me
free,
like to talk about.
and it was perfect when we had our conversation. And I had a note with the 3 things down, but I never got to it because we had a really good conversation. We sorted out everything that I needed to know from her, and she was happy that I was giving her that information. So just.
Excuse me, ladies, sorry to interrupt y'all. No, y'all are fine, y'all can stay. I just want to know, I'm about
Oh,
to
that's
have to get
fine.
rid of the
Take it.
bagels and everything, or
Yeah,
y'all?
I help myself.
Okay, I just want to make
Thank you.
sure.
So she's all set. She knows what's going on, and that's what's important. I just didn't get to sanctuary on
It's
the
okay.
So because it's not important anymore, because I don't know about it.
And I apologize also, because I got all bent out of shape because I didn't see the article about the art museum on June 28th in the May.
I know.
Yeah,
I
and
knew
she-
just what
yeah.
happened, but I didn't want you to call Cece because we have to be respectful of the staff. And can you imagine if they got a call from a congregant
Oh.
for everything that somebody